Welcome to the Sons of Mjolnir podcast.
The Sons of... what?
This isn't your Sons of Macaroni, yeah!
The Sons of Mjolnir?
This is Sons of Mjolnir, yeah!
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Sons of Mjolnir. As always, I am your host, Fat Thor, and today I am joined by a very special guest. You may know him as the writer of such titles as Wolverine Max, Punisher, Ant-Man, Casual Fling, along with a bunch of other crime novels, and also the most recent Silicon Bandits with artist Dalibor Telejic. I hope I'm saying that right. I probably butchered that. But I am joined by the wonderful Jason Starr. Jason, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
I'm super excited to talk to you. We're going to be talking about, like I said, the new book, Silicon Bandits. But before we get to that, something we typically like to do here on the show is kind of go through people's comic origin story, you know, how you got into the medium, all that kind of stuff. So I saw that you grew up in Brooklyn and you always grew up reading comics. You talked about getting them from the candy store and reading them in the Sunday paper, using the ink to make tattoos, stuff like that. And you also said that you read a lot of Spider-Man and that you usually gravitated more towards Marvel when you were growing up. So I'm just curious, what was it about the Marvel universe specifically that really kind of piqued your interest and really started to grab you?
I think initially it was just because growing up in New York, the Spider-Man comic was syndicated, the Stan Lee Spider-Man comic and some other Marvel comics were always syndicated in the Sunday paper. So when I was really young, that was like the first stuff I was exposed to. And yeah, the TV shows at the time, you know, there was Spider-Man TV show, etc. But I did like, you know, I was a big Superman fan also, and I really like Plastic Man for some reason. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I love Plastic Man, dude. He's such
Bring
a
back Plastic Man Max.
Yeah, absolutely. I am 100% in agreement. And I think a lot of people underestimate Plastic Man. Like, his powers are pretty damn powerful when you think of like what you can do with that.
Yeah.
So I love it. I love a good Plastic Man shout.
And who knew plastic was going to be so bad for the environment back then? Like, we didn't even know.
Yeah, maybe we need a name change for our old boy there to update with the times. But you talked about too, which I thought was really interesting, that you didn't really start writing, or writing didn't really get to you until like you were in college, that you were kind of more, you were actually a baseball player before that and were kind of more focused on that. So I'm curious, where did that kind of creative spark come from to just like start writing one day, especially like I said, when you were kind of more focused on sports and things of that nature?
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely wasn't interested in reading or writing to any great extent. I didn't like I'm still not crazy about having stuff like assigned to me to do. Like, you have to do this, you have to read this, you have to do that, you have to do this. You know, so I prefer, like, you know, making those choices on my own, like what I want to be involved with. So like I think when I started discovering books on my own that were like really interesting to me, I guess that's, you know, like when I was younger, just discovering comic books, but yeah, discovering novels that were exciting to me, like crime fiction, mystery fiction, genre fiction of any kind, really, except for the sort of classics that were like assigned to me in high school, and you have to read one chapter, you know, by Monday, and there's going to be a quiz. It didn't seem fun. So I know like education has evolved since then. I know a lot of teachers make it more fun now, but yeah, when I was growing up, it seemed very regimented, so that was part of it. But I think I was always creative to some extent. Like, I liked drawing, I just didn't really have like an outlet for it. Yeah,
well, I'm glad you found that outlet, because then now we got all this great stuff, and then all that accumulated into your first crime novel, Cold Caller, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So you did the first novel, and I'm curious, so not having written anything before and, you know, kind of starting out on this journey, what was it about the crime genre that really, like, you were like, oh, I wanted to add my voice to this? I mean, there's so many different genres to write about, you know?
Well, my first book was published when I was about late 20s, 30. So, I mean, there was a period of time like when I was writing and just not getting stuff published. Um, I was working a lot of different jobs in publishing, working for magazines. And I was writing plays at the time. Actually, I have a master's degree in playwriting, and I was very interested in plays and theater, and I was writing um, plays, and I had a few things off Broadway here in New York produced. But I was reading a lot at the time, like a lot of crime fiction, like discovering, like I was saying before, like discovering books on my own. Um, so I was reading a lot of Elmore Leonard, some of the classic, like Jim Thompson, James M. Cain. Like I always loved old film noir movies. So my first book, Cold Caller, was partly because I really loved noir fiction and Jim Thompson books like The Grifters and Pop 1280 and The Killer Inside Me and books like that. And also because I had many jobs as a telemarketer, so I knew that world really well. So I just brought the two things together, and so that's the autobiographical component of that book. The crime and murder is not
Yeah,
autobiographical.
that's the fiction
the,
part.
but the milieu of telemarketing was definitely, from my own experience. And they say that like the first a writer's first book, or I guess for first comic also, is usually maybe, I'm not sure how it applies to comics, but like autobiographical. So I think in that sense, like it's always good to like write about something like you really know really well. I mean, that would be like my advice to anybody starting out, like real, especially if it's your first thing. Because what seems banal to you might be like really unusual to somebody else. Like if you have some job that just seems sort of, not that interesting. Like I think there's always a way to write it that's like makes it really exciting to somebody who doesn't know about that world.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you can think of a million examples of things like, I don't know, The Office or Curb Your Enthusiasm,
Yeah,
taking the kind of mundane and showing how it can be interesting. And I just
yeah,
love that
for sure.
too, like how you talk about, you always had that creativity in you, but you just needed that kind of outlet to bring it all out. And like I said, lucky for us that you did find that outlet, because you're doing all this great stuff. And then fast forward a little bit, you start getting into comics. 2008, you did an intro for DC Vertigo, and that kind of got you into the comic scene a little bit. And one thing I loved that you talked about was how you really enjoy the collaboration in comics as opposed to, writing novels, which is a much more solitary activity. So that's something that we love to talk about here on the podcast, like the power of collaboration, especially in comic books. So I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, the power of good collaboration in comic books and how that results in the best possible product.
Um, yeah, so like I was saying before, I did have a background like working somewhat in theater. I mean, I wasn't like a theater person, but
Yeah.
I'd been part of some theater companies, and it's also extremely collaborative, because you're working with the director, the actors, everyone involved. And it was interesting when I got involved at Marvel to see that a lot of the editors and up and coming editors also had like some sort of theater experience. So it was interesting to see those two worlds sort of like mix. But I think there is a similarity there. And yeah, I mean, because I have had a long career writing novels, which is very solitary. I'm just, it's all in my own head. I don't even often discuss like what I'm working on with anybody until it's done. It's sort of refreshing and a nice balance to be working on something where you're working very closely, like in comics, like with the editor, like on this book, Silicon Bandits, is coming out in April. Working on developing the project with the editors at Magma Comix, but also working with Dalibor, the artist, on the the art and interacting with him and watching it as I'm writing it, watch the art and the colors and everything become, it takes on a life that I didn't envision myself. So I think that's the most gratifying part of it, to see something that grows and becomes something that I myself couldn't envision. Because when I have like a comic script, it's sort of a skeletal version of what it is. The story is there, but it really does come to life in a different way than writing a book. For example, if I want something, sometimes I'll just give Dalibor a note, like, make this look really cool. Like the scene. And in a novel, I would have to do intensive research and like make sure I got every detail right and this and that. But the art really fills those gaps really well. So but it's interesting, so it's not just my creative vision, it's the artist, the colorist, the letter artist, it all comes together.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing that, again, the reason why we talk about it a lot here on the podcast is a lot of people from the outside looking in don't really realize like how many hands it takes to really bring a comic book to, like, from idea to print to all of the steps it takes. So I love just hearing about, how people work together, and again, the power of collaboration. Before we get into Silicone Bandits, this applies a little bit to the premise of Silicone Bandits. I thought something that I thought was super interesting was you talked a little bit about like coming up with ideas, and like when people ask you like, oh, how do you come up ideas? And you said that it's not a matter of coming up with an idea, but coming up with the right idea. Could you talk a little bit about your perspective on that? Like, finding the right idea and how you discover what the right idea is?
Yeah, because my biggest thing I want to avoid is working on something, especially if it's a novel, because a comic, like in most cases, like I've pitched an idea, I know the idea is liked by the publisher, and then we develop it. But especially for a novel, I don't want to be working on something that's not going to go anywhere, or not going to sell, or not going to be commercial. So like it's a matter of time. Like I don't want to spend like 6 months, a year working on something that's not going to go anywhere. And I think over time I've developed some instincts for, like, if I start something, like I always have an outline, I know where it's going, and I think I have a sense of like whether some people might like it. There were some times earlier on in my career where I wrote like half a book, and then I realized it's not going anywhere, or it's not really that good. So I want to avoid all of that. Like, so you have to just like make sure you could navigate all of that.
Yeah.
I think that's like the main thing.
And then once you have this idea and then you start crafting out this world, you had a video where you talk about world building on your YouTube channel that I really enjoyed. And when you were talking about it, you said that when you're building a world, it's important to be an expert in that world and know it inside and out. And obviously, this is very different in comic books and with novels, because like you talk about a lot, with novels, you have unlimited space, but with a comic book, you're limited to that 24 pages for each issue, and depending on how long, your series is. So could you just touch a little bit on the process of world building and the difference in your approach for a comic book as it pertains to like a novel, which, like I said, you have this unlimited space?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to think about like that. If a comic like Silicon Bandits is initially 4 issues, 24 pages each issue. You want each issue to end with some exciting cliffhanger. So it's not a matter of just like having the idea, having a cool concept, but then breaking it down and making sure that you have like 4 distinct parts. And I usually think about like what the big scenes are, like what the big moments are, like where the action's going to be, because that could take up like 3-4 pages, and I'll think about where that's going to happen. But I definitely want to have like a theme and building up toward like some sort of dramatic conclusion, but it has to be exactly on page 24. And when I first started writing comics, that was like the hardest thing to get used to, because like I might have an idea for a great ending, but then I realize it's too rushed, like it happened too fast. And yeah, like when I was working on Wolverine Max, and before that, like I was working closely with Axel Alonso, who was at Marvel at the time and now is at AWA. Yeah, and there would be times when he would like spread out like my end, whatever I did with the ending, like if it was rushed, he would make sure it's like more spread out. And the pacing is really important in a comic, like how you pace it to build toward that end, and to make sure you have like the ups and downs in the right spot, and techniques for creating little cliffhangers at the end of each page, because you have the page turn effect in comics that you don't have in a novel, because when you're writing a novel, you have no idea like if what you're writing is going to be page 9 or page 14, depending on how the book was formatted. But in a comic, you can imagine visually this is going to be page 6, for example, and you want to make sure like the page, the turn to page 7 might be dramatic. So the character goes, opens the door, you see the lock turning, opens it, and then like the surprise is like on the next page. So you have to, you're always thinking about little ways to make it interesting and exciting just to turn the pages. Because even though someone's reading a comic fairly fast, like you might read a 24-page comic in 5-10 minutes the first time, you still, I think there's definitely an expectation among comics readers that it has to be like suspenseful in the way the pages are turned, and that it's building, and that the end is has a cliffhanger that makes you really want to get that next issue.
I love that. And I always thought like that's it. I'm not a comic writer, obviously. I just talk about it on the internet, but I always felt like that would be one of the hardest decisions to make, is like you're saying, deciding on how to pace the issue within that 24 pages, because like you just said, you got to have a kind of cliffhanger at the end to make people want to read the next issue, and then putting in effect like the page turns and all that stuff. It's just that it's amazing how you guys put that all together into a book.
Well, it might seem like you could write a comic I mean, it doesn't, if you just open a comic, it might seem like, well, there's not much dialogue, you could probably write it pretty fast, and I guess you can under some circumstances. But it seems to take me as long as like writing like a page of a book to write a page of a comic, because it's not, well, I might just be writing more if I'm writing a book. In a comic, I'm really thinking about what the page is going to look like, how many panels are going to be on the page, and like in Silicon Bandits, like Dalibor might have his own ideas. Like I might think it's going to be 6 panels, and he might come up with a way to make it 5 or 7 or something different, which is fine. Like he takes it to his own, he adds his own touch to it. But I at least have some idea of like what it's going to look like, and that requires like thoughts. I'm just like moving scenes around, trying to make the dialogue as concise as possible. You don't want to be repetitive. So like if there's 2 characters and there's some sort of like dialogue scene, you have to think of like inventive ways to do it, different angles, focusing on like maybe like a little detail in the room. Like if there's a gun, for example, like maybe the shot is just the gun and the dialogue's happening off screen, so to speak. So those little things, just so it doesn't, like you might just read through if you're just reading it really fast, but just I'm always thinking about like I don't want it to seem redundant. And I know Dalibor's thinking about that in the art also. Like he wants it to be like fresh and like inventive, as opposed to just being predictable.
Yeah, well, I think he's knocking it out of the park, because not only is the story great in this book, but the art is also fantastic. And speaking of world building and how you're approaching this,
Oh yeah,
let's get into a little bit of this world building for
right,
Silicon
right.
Bandits. So, Silicon Bandits takes place 2089. You describe it as a post-apocalyptic world, but one that's still functioning, and where automation and AI have begun to fully start to take over. You've also said that this is a heist story mixed with a sci-fi world, which, I mean, folks, what else do you need besides that? I'm, hooked already with that tagline right there. But going back again to like the world building aspect, what we were just talking about, with a story like this, and especially with the time that we're living in right now, with AI is all the rage of conversation. There's plenty, Blade Runner, take your pick of futuristic kind of stories. So I feel like in crafting a world like this, it would, at least for me, not being a writer, it would be very hard to make something that is fresh and new. So when you were building this world for Silicon Bandits, what were some of the elements that you wanted to include to really differentiate this world?
Uh, that's a good question. Um, well, first off, like I've done some uh world building before, and I haven't really written like a hard sci-fi book like this one
Hmm.
before. I wrote a short series of novels called The Pack, and there were two books in that series, but it that was like a fantasy werewolf series set in New York, and that definitely required like a lot of world building, and a lot of like backstory that's not necessarily in the work itself, but like I think it's important just to have an idea in your head of like what the backstory is, and I definitely do for um Silicon Bandit. So for me, it was like um yeah, I wrote like a mini Bible of like what the backstory is, like how the world got to this place,
Hmm.
5 world wars, uh trillionaires have divided the country into different quadrants. Yeah, like a lot of people, I'm very interested, concerned about artificial intelligence, but also Andrew Yang talking about how AI is going to take over, and basic income. That's been on my
Hmm.
mind. Also, so I was just like imagining uh, a world like what would the world possibly be like 60, 70 years from now, and I wanted to think about like the time when androids are just like merging like with the human population, like really integrated, and like what conflicts could come out of that.
Hmm.
um the other thing for me is like every time I've branched into a different genre in my books, like the werewolf book I was talking about, but also my last novel, The Next Time I Die, which is a crime novel, but also has a sci-fi alternate reality twist. There's always
Hmm.
like a crime fiction element in it.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to write like a heist story, and just that happens to take place 80 years in the future in this other world where androids are intermingled. So that's like what my mindset has been. Like it's just about these characters and like what they want and what their desires are, and while I have an idea of what's going on in the world, and we definitely like are building out the world,
Hmm.
um, I really want like those details to come in like when it's appropriate for the story. I'm not just like uh, front loading a lot of like world building about this world
Hmm.
just for the sake of having it there. It's the story that I hope like is gripping, and then the elements to the world, like how the world functions and how it's changed, and uh, stuff that's happened to the environment. Like those details are all in there, but they come out like when it's appropriate. For example, like um, this story takes place in a city called New Phoenix, that I called it, a futuristic version of Phoenix, Arizona.
Hmm.
And there's a time when they like leave later in the comic. They leave that area and they go. I'm not going to give anything away, to another area, but that's like when those details come in about like what happened to the world and like why it's
Hmm.
changed. So I'm not like front loading it. Like I want it to be sort of like I want the reader to wonder and then like
Yeah.
to answer those questions slowly and have it sort of just like a Polaroid developing, just sort of like slowly reveal itself.
Hmm.
So that's been the goal. And yeah, definitely, the art though, like we were talking about collaboration, like definitely like takes the world building to another level because the artists come up with stuff that like I wasn't even thinking about that have definitely you know made it like really clear and visual and yeah, I guess like reminiscent of like Blade Runner or something.
Yeah, I love that approach. And I think you absolutely nailed it in this first issue, at least the pages that I got to read, because you get enough information to know, like, okay, again, like it's 2089, they're
Right,
doing the AI stuff, but I never felt like I was being like info dumped on, like with all
right.
this stuff, all the things that you learn, like you were talking about, come from conversation or, things of that nature. So it feels very natural. I felt like I just kind of stepped into this world, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, here we are now. So again, you definitely nailed it in that aspect, and I was left with plenty of questions that I can't wait to figure out with how the world got this way. But speaking of characters, you mentioned characters really quickly, and I want to talk about your main characters here. We got Aurora, Kenji, and then at the tail end of the issue we are introduced to Johnny, and I'm sure that we'll be introduced to some more characters along the way. But you said that you really wanted these characters to feel real and relatable. Back to kind of what we were talking about with the limited page space, how do you approach making these characters relatable and real, again, with that kind of limited space of pages?
um it's definitely a challenge, but I think you just have to understand hopefully what the for me it's always like a matter of understanding what the characters want, like what their objective is, what the situation is. um I mean, in this case, they're fired from their job, and they come up with some sort of revenge plan. Again, I don't want to give
Mhm.
way too many
Yeah, no
details,
spoilers here, people.
but they, I think it's looking for something like that. That's like a universal emotion
Mhm.
that you would feel in any world. Because like even though this is taking place in the future, everyone knows what it's like. Can imagine at least what it's like to be fired from a job and like
Mhm.
be angry about it and this and that. I mean, that's what my first novel, Cold Caller, was about. So he
Yeah.
gets fired from his telemarketing job. Um, so it's like finding that yeah, that sort of universal human condition sort of emotion that and then there's a relationship that the two characters that you mentioned, Kenji and Aurora, are married.
Mhm.
um so you get a sense of what their marriage is like, a little bit about their past, and the conflicts in their relationship, and that is going to affect the plot of the book. So my idea is always to like hook you into the characters, hopefully, and then the story comes, along with that.
Yeah, and I mean, again, knocked it out of the park because I was definitely invested, especially again, no spoilers here. I'm not going to spoil it. People need to discover this for themselves, but one of the plot elements that you introduced to the relationship between them, I thought was really great and really invested me to see where that's going to go in the next couple issues. Something that really stuck out to me in this first issue, and again, no spoilers, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but if it is, you can tell me so and I'll cut it out. But a line that really stuck out to me in this first issue was, I don't remember which character said it, but they said, creators are always expendable. And I won't give any context to what that is. I wanted to ask you, with the current state of how things are today, obviously you're very interested in the kind of technology and AI and all that stuff. So with all the talk of, AI in the comic book industry and AI in movies and stuff, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on and your perspective on AI being involved in the comic book industry?
um yeah, I mean, that line like applies to what's going on in the story, uh
Yeah,
uh
and real life.
specifically because these main characters, Kenji and Aurora, are computer programmers, scientists that created these androids, and they're potentially being replaced. So yeah, I mean, I was definitely aware of like the metaphor
Hmm.
for what's going on now.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's why getting back to what you were saying before, like why it would resonate, um, because of like what the situation the characters are in is very identifiable, like with what's going on now, and not
Hmm.
only in the comics industry, but like just by every industry.
I would
There
say,
was like
yeah, everywhere.
yeah, there was like some statistic that like in 20 years, 40% of the world's jobs are going to be gone. Um, so that's sort of like uh, the world of Silicon Bandits is like 30, 40 years past that point.
Hmm.
Um, so that's definitely what I'm going for there. Um, yeah, I think everyone in comics, I don't think people in comics are more concerned about it than any other
Hmm.
industry though. But I basically think that like, especially in art, it's just not as interesting for me if humans aren't creating it. Like the
Yeah.
main, you know, I think there's you know, whether you're looking at paintings or reading novels or comics, like there's something about like the human condition and like a human communicating with another human about like what they're feeling and want you to feel what they're feeling that
Hmm.
like makes books interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it would be as interesting if like things were just if art was just created by artificial intelligence. It might look on the surface like passable, but I don't think it would have that resonance just
Hmm.
if it just completely took over. So hopefully that never happens, because I don't think
Yeah,
I think art
absolutely
would be
not.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and I totally agree. And as a creative yourself, I'm sure that you know exactly what I'm talking about. But when you see a piece of art or read an amazing novel or a comic book, like there's a certain, for lack of a better word, like there's a soul to it. You know what I mean? Like there's something, like you said, that you identify with the human condition. Like there's something there. But when you see stuff that's made by AI, it's missing that. Even if it is, like you said, like passable or whatnot,
Right.
it's just like that's not art. You know what I mean? And like I said, that line just really resonated in me because it just feels like you said, not even just comics, but really everywhere. You have these people at the top, worrying about the bottom line, trying to replace the human element or the creative element in these creative things. And so, again, I just thought that line was very poignant, very hit home for what we're dealing with today. And so Silicon Bandits going to be hitting shops on April 10th. And we're talking about this great world and all these kind of unique elements that you have to it. And you already said that this is going to be a 4-issue series, but I got to ask, I feel, even though I've only read the first issue, like we were talking about, I'm left with a lot of questions, and you definitely hooked me in this world. So I feel like there's a lot more stories to be told in this world. And so while
Uh,
I know there's only 4 issues in the series, is there any hopes of something else in
I
this
have,
world?
I mean, I have like in the back of my mind like ways it can go on and on
Mm-hmm.
and on and on. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Hey, fingers crossed.
We'll
Yeah.
have those discussions. Yeah.
Well, hey, that's a perfect reason why everyone that is watching and listening to this right now, you need to call your local comic shop, tell them that you want Silicone Bandits, and then when it comes out on April 10th, you need to run there and pick up your copy. I guarantee that you'll love it. I really loved the issue that I was able to read. Thank you so much. Shout out to Magma as well for setting up this interview and all of this stuff. Great people. But Jason, I got to ask you before we get out of here, something that we always like to ask our guests before we get out of here is, what are you reading and watching lately? Like, what is inspiring you? What are you really gravitating towards right now? I know you're busy writing your own stuff, but I'm sure you got some downtime.
In comics, what have I been reading? Like Philadelphia,
Great shout.
um, what else was I reading lately? I mean, I always read like Ed Brubaker and John Phillips' new stuff.
Classic.
TV, what have I been watching? Love is Blind.
Oh, nice. Some good old reality television, man. Sometimes you just got to turn the brain off and just eat
No,
some stuff
I
like
watch a
that.
lot of I mean, I really love Poor Things in movies lately. I mean, it
Mhm.
was like the best movie I saw this year. Yeah, so I'm always like, I see a lot of theater here in New York, but mainly just movies, TV.
Awesome. I love it. Like I said, we just
And
always like to ask people what they're consuming. You know, as a creator, I'm sure it's hard to unplug yourself sometimes and really get into that kind of stuff. But besides that, Jason, I just got to say thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this book. Everyone, like I said, April 10th, be sure to tell your shops you want it. And before we get out of here, Jason, throw it off to you really quickly. Plug yourself, tell the people where they can find you. Anything else you got besides Silicone Bandits that people should look out for?
Just I'm at Jason Starr Books on X and Instagram and jasonstar.com. And yeah, Silicon Bandits. And my last book was The Next Time I Die, but I've written over 20 novels, so you could check them out.
Ooh, yeah, add them to your list, my people, because Jason's got the sauce. I will tell you that right now. And again, Silicone Bandits, April 10th. You cannot miss it. Jason, I cannot thank you enough for hanging out with me today. It's been so much fun. If you guys at home enjoyed this video, please consider giving us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, head over to bcwsupplies.com and use code Sons of Mjolnir for 10% off all your bags, boards, anything you need to collect. We have you covered. The code again is Sons of Mjolnir. Jason, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope all your stacks are fat this week. I hope that you all stay hydrated, and we will see you guys all next time.
I can do this all day.